Next year, it will be 20 years since the publication of a book called The Gift of the Stranger, Faith, Hospitality and Language Learning that I wrote with my colleague Barbara Carville. When this book came out, it was quite unusual. There simply weren't other books around that were trying to combine an interest in Christian theology with an interest in language learning. And in fact, the book partly came out of my own frustrations with that gap over a number of years, and those of my colleague Barbara as well. Before working on the book, for a number of years, I'd been teaching high school in England, and I taught languages. And a few years before I started teaching high school, I'd become a Christian, and I was in this struggle of trying to figure out how these two parts of my identity, that I was a Christian and I was a language teacher, might relate to each other. Because within a few years of beginning to teach languages, it became clear to me that the curricula that I'd been given, the ways of teaching languages in which I'd been trained, were not simply neutral technique. They weren't just language teaching. There was other stuff going on in there. So a number of years before I started teaching languages, there'd been kind of a revolution in my discipline where we'd moved away from a central focus on grammar and grammar tables and so on, and towards more of a focus on communication, on being able to get things done with words in various social circumstances. And that had led for a while to curriculum materials that had a heavy focus on being able to buy things in cafes, order in restaurants, get train tickets, go on vacations abroad, talk about yourself to new people. And a lot of this was practically useful. It was things that people could use when they traveled abroad, but it also started to feel very egocentric. It was like we spent most of the time talking about ourselves and asking other people for things using the new language that we'd learned. And then when you added to that the sense that the kind of sentences we practiced in class, when we actually used the language, we talked first person an awful lot. This is my name, this is my house, this is where I live, this is my favorite food, I like this kind of music, I went on this trip last year. We didn't spend as much time learning to listen to other people well, learning to listen to their stories. And we didn't spend enough time learning about culture. And then when students asked us what the goals of language learning were, why am I in a language class, why do I have to learn this? I realized we often tended to instinctively start giving them answers like, well, it will help you get a job, it will help you get into university, it will help your future career in this way or this way. And again, those are not invalid reasons. Those are reasons why people learn languages, but cumulatively they started to feel like exclusively egocentric reasons for learning languages, as if the only reason that another person's language is important is because it somehow helps me to promote my goals in terms of my own life trajectory. It started to feel as if we were learning German, not because Germans were important, but because it might be a useful tool for us to get ahead. So alongside that, like I said, I'd recently become a Christian, and so my Christian formation is starting to teach me that loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself are at the heart of what it means to be human. And so I start to experience this friction between the two stories that are shaping my identity, the story that's coming from my Christian formation and the story that's coming from my professional formation as a language educator. In the midst of that struggle, I came into contact with Barbara Carville, who was teaching at Calvin College, where I now work in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And she'd been thinking about these same things and had been starting to make some headway with trying to articulate another way of running at this. So we met at a conference, we met a year later at another conference, and we started sketching the outline of a book. I remember us writing chapter titles on a napkin in Derby Railway Station in England. And the book that we came up with tried to take a single core thought and work it all the way through the different phases of language teaching. And that core thought was that at the heart of biblical ethics is a call to be hospitable to strangers. So in Leviticus 19, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's where Jesus got it from. And a few verses later, it says, love the alien, love the stranger as yourself. In the same chapter. So these two love someone as yourself utterances right next to each other. Love your neighbor as yourself, love the stranger as yourself. And this echoes all the way through the rest of Scripture. Continues into the New Testament. Jesus said a difference between the sheep and the goats was that the sheep welcomed strangers and the goats didn't. Don't forget to welcome strangers, it says in Hebrews. So to take this core idea and to say, what if we started from the hunch that the core reason why we learn other languages and other cultures is because there's this fundamental ethical call to human beings to be hospitable towards strangers. Now, that's a starting point. Once you've got that kind of articulation, you can talk about that, you can try to sound inspiring about that. But what happens if I now come back to my language classroom and I say that my language class is all about hospitality to strangers? It's about trying to love my neighbour, even though my neighbour speaks another language, comes from another culture, thinks differently, has different stories. Learning to bridge that divide, learning to listen well. What if I say that and my curriculum is still mostly shopping dialogues, cafe dialogues, talking about what I did on my summer vacation, talking about my favourite music? You get a mismatch between the rhetoric and the reality of the way the curriculum is designed, the way classroom interaction is designed. So the question then arises, how do I start as a language professional? How do I start redesigning my materials, the pictures that I choose, the dialogue material that I choose, the topics I bring into the classroom, the tasks I design for students, in a way that it works as language acquisition? This is not stopping being a language teacher and going and doing a Bible study. This has to work as a language class, but a language class that's designed on the assumption that what we are learning how to do is to exercise hospitality towards strangers. The Gift of the Stranger was our first large-scale attempt to articulate that and to work through the background rationale, the history of Christian involvement in the discipline, classroom methodology, textbooks, all the different parts of language education, and to start pointing to how Christian language professionals might be able to work their faith into every aspect of their teaching, whether or not they're teaching in a Christian school, more as an act of basic faithfulness to try to get a fit between basic beliefs and convictions and the way that we're designing our work as language professionals.